December 1943. The transport train rolled across the endless flatness of Nebraska, its wheels clicking a monotonous rhythm that had become the soundtrack of Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto's new reality. Through the frosted window, he watched an America he had been taught could not possibly exist. The propaganda films back home had shown a nation on its knees, cities burning, people starving in breadlines. But here, in the heart of what his commanders had called a dying empire, farmhouses stood proud against the winter sky, smoke rising from chimneys in perfect vertical lines. Each one had electric lines running to it, like veins carrying impossible vitality. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners were about to witness would shatter everything they had been taught about their enemy, and in doing so reveal a truth more devastating than any defeat on the battlefield. They had been lied to about everything. The prisoner of war camp outside Fort Robinson, Nebraska, held 347 Japanese soldiers, sailors and airmen captured across the Pacific Theater. Yamamoto had been pulled from the wreckage of his fighter plane near Rabaul in October, his left arm broken in 2 places, his pride shattered into even more pieces. Lieutenant Kenji Honda had survived the sinking of his submarine off the Philippines. Corporal Yuki Tanaka had been found unconscious on Tarawa, the sole survivor of his bunker. Each man carried the same shame, the same conviction that they had failed their emperor, their families, their ancestors stretching back through centuries of honor. The camp itself was unlike anything they had expected. The barracks were heated. The beds had mattresses. On their first day, they had been issued winter coats, boots that fit, and told they would receive male privileges. Honda had laughed bitterly at that last point. Who would write to a man who had disgraced himself by allowing capture? In Japan, their families would have already held funeral services, mourning sons who were considered dead the moment they surrendered. Captain William Morrison, the camp commander, was a Nebraska farmer who had been called up for service at age 42. He stood before the assembled prisoners that first morning, his weathered face betraying none of the hostility they had anticipated. Through an interpreter, he explained the rules. They would work on local farms, helping to harvest crops and maintain livestock. They would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Any attempt at escape would result in punishment, but not death, not torture, just isolation and loss of privileges. Yamamoto had exchanged glances with Honda. 80 cents per day? They were to be paid. For farm work. The confusion was universal among the prisoners. This had to be some elaborate deception, a trick to lower their guard before the real treatment began. The first work detail left camp on a Monday morning in January 1944. 15 prisoners, including Yamamoto, Honda, and Tanaka, were loaded into the back of a truck and driven 20 miles into the countryside. The landscape was alien to men who had grown up on mountainous islands or in dense cities. Here, the earth stretched flat to every horizon, broken only by farmhouses, barns, and the skeletal remains of harvested cornfields. They arrived at the Jensen farm just after sunrise. Harold Jensen was a tall man with hands like slabs of beef and a face that seemed carved from the same red soil he farmed. His wife, Martha, was smaller, but carried herself with the same quiet strength. Their 2 children, both girls, watched the prisoners with wide eyes from the safety of the farmhouse porch. Through the interpreter, a Nisei soldier named James Nakamura, who served as the camp's liaison, Jensen explained the day's work. The prisoners would help repair fencing damaged by winter storms, clear snow from the livestock shelter, and prepare the equipment shed for spring planting. Simple work. Honest work. The kind of labor Yamamoto had watched his own grandfather perform on their small plot in Hiroshima Prefecture. But it was during the lunch break that the first crack appeared in the prisoners' understanding of their enemy. Martha Jensen brought out lunch for everyone. Not scraps, not prisoner rations, but the same food her family was eating. Thick sandwiches made with real meat, apples, fresh milk, cookies that were still warm. She set the baskets down on a table in the barn and smiled at the prisoners, saying something in English that Nakamura translated as "welcome" and "please eat your fill." Yamamoto stared at the food. Back home, even before the war had truly begun to turn against them, his family had been rationing rice. His mother had learned to make soup from vegetable scraps. His younger brother had written about school children being sent to dig up wild plants to supplement their diet. And here, on a single farm in enemy territory, there was more food than 15 hungry men could possibly consume. Honda picked up a sandwich with trembling hands. "This is a trick," he whispered in Japanese. "They want to see if we'll act like animals, fighting over food." But Tanaka, the youngest of them at just 20 years old, had already taken a bite. His eyes went wide. "It's real," he said, his voice cracking. "It's all real." They ate in silence, each man wrestling with implications they could not yet fully process. When Harold Jensen returned and saw the empty baskets, he smiled and said something that made Nakamura pause before translating. "Mr. Jensen says his wife was worried she hadn't made enough. He asks if you would like more." More, there was more. The work detail returned to the Jensen farm twice a week for the next 3 months. Each visit revealed new impossibilities. The farmhouse had electric lights in every room, not just 1 or 2 as a luxury. They had a radio that could receive stations from across the country. The children's bedroom had more toys than Yamamoto had seen in his entire childhood. Most shocking of all, the Jensens had a telephone, a private line connecting them to neighbors and the town, as if such casual communication across distances was merely ordinary. One afternoon in March, a spring storm rolled in suddenly, as they often did on the plains. Rain fell in sheets, turning the farmyard to mud. Jensen gestured for the prisoners to follow him, and they ran through the downpour to the farmhouse. Martha met them at the door with towels, ushering them inside without hesitation. They stood dripping in the kitchen, 15 enemy soldiers in the home of an American family, and Martha Jensen handed each of them a cup of hot coffee. Yamamoto found himself staring at a photograph on the wall. It showed a young man in an American military uniform, his smile broad and confident. The face had the same features as Harold Jensen, but younger. "Our son," Martha said softly, noticing Yamamoto's gaze. Nakamura translated. "He's with the Marines, in the Pacific, fighting your people." The words hung in the air like an accusation. But Martha's face showed no anger, no hatred, just a mother's worry for a child far from home, facing danger every day. She looked at Yamamoto and then at the photograph, and something passed between them that needed no translation. 2 mothers' sons on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen, both hoping to survive to see their homes again. "Why do you feed us?" Yamamoto asked suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Nakamura hesitated, then translated. "Why do you treat us like this? Your son fights against us. We tried to harm your country. Why do you show us kindness?" Harold Jensen had entered the kitchen in time to hear the question. He looked at Yamamoto for a long moment, then spoke. Nakamura's translation came slowly, carefully. "Because you're here and you're hungry, and that's all that matters in my house. The war is out there somewhere, in here. We're just people trying to get by. Besides, I remember being young and far from home once. Everyone deserves to be treated like a human being." That night, back in the barracks, Yamamoto lay awake on his mattress, staring at the ceiling. Around him, other prisoners engaged in whispered conversations that had become increasingly common. They talked about what they had seen. The abundance that seemed impossible yet was undeniably real. The way American farmers had tractors and trucks and equipment that would have been considered luxuries for entire villages back home. The casual waste of resources that to Japanese sensibilities seemed almost criminal, yet somehow spoke to wealth beyond comprehension. "My work detail went to a different farm today," Honda said from the neighboring bunk. "The farmer's wife told our interpreter that she's worried about butter rationing. Butter. She considers having to limit butter a hardship. Takeshi, my family hasn't seen butter in 3 years. What kind of nation is so wealthy that limiting butter is considered a sacrifice?" The question haunted them all. Japan's entire strategy had been built on the assumption that America was soft, weak, divided, that a nation of luxury lovers would crumble when faced with true hardship, that Japan's warrior spirit and willingness to sacrifice would overcome American material advantages. But what they were seeing here in the middle of nowhere, on ordinary farms worked by ordinary people, suggested something far more troubling. America wasn't suffering. America wasn't even close to suffering. While Japan scraped for every resource, melting down temple bells for metal and training children to fight with bamboo spears, American farmers worried about butter rations and complained about gasoline restrictions that still left them with more fuel than most Japanese military units. In April, the prisoners were assigned to help with spring planting. They worked alongside American farmers in the fields, operating equipment most had never imagined existed. The tractors alone represented mechanical sophistication beyond what many Japanese factories could produce. Each tractor did the work of dozens of men, and every farm seemed to have at least one, often more. Corporal Tanaka, who had worked in his father's machine shop before the war, became obsessed with understanding how everything functioned. He studied the tractors, the mechanical seeders, the irrigation systems, with the intensity he had once devoted to military drills. One day, Harold Jensen noticed his interest and spent an entire afternoon explaining how the equipment worked, pulling parts apart to show Tanaka the mechanisms inside. Through Nakamura, Tanaka asked question after question. Where were these machines made? How many existed? How did farmers afford them? The answers were devastating in their simplicity. The tractors were made in factories across the Midwest, tens of thousands of them produced each year. Farmers bought them on credit or through government programs designed to increase agricultural efficiency. And this was just for farming. The same factories that made tractors could be retooled to make tanks, trucks, aircraft. The same industrial capacity that created agricultural abundance could be turned to military production with ease. We were told America couldn't sustain a long war, Tanaka said quietly to Yamamoto that evening. We were told their industry was overextended, their resources stretched thin. But I've seen more industrial capacity on Nebraska farms than existed in my entire prefecture. How many farms like this does America have? Thousands, tens of thousands. And all of this is just the excess, the overflow of their productivity. What have we been fighting? The question kept Yamamoto awake that night, and many nights after. He thought about his training, the constant emphasis on spirit over material, on the warrior's determination being the ultimate weapon. They had been taught that American soldiers were weak, that they valued comfort over honor, that they would break when faced with true resolve. But now he understood the trap in that thinking. Yes, Americans valued comfort, but they had so much comfort that even their prisoners lived better than Japanese civilians. Yes, they relied on machines, but they had so many machines that they could afford to lose hundreds of tanks, thousands of planes, and simply make more. Japan had sent men to die because that was all they had left to send. America sent machines to fight because that's what they had in unlimited supply. And when those machines were destroyed, they didn't mourn them or hold funeral services. They just built more. By summer, the prisoners had become a familiar sight in the local community. They worked on dozens of farms across the county, and while they remained prisoners, the relationship had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. Some farmers began requesting specific prisoners, men they had come to know as good workers, reliable and skilled. The prisoners, in turn, began to take pride in their work, finding dignity in labor they had initially seen as humiliation. Yamamoto's detail had remained primarily at the Jensen farm, and over the months, something like a routine had developed. They arrived each morning, worked hard throughout the day, and during breaks, conversations began to happen. At first, these were strictly practical, instructions about tasks, questions about techniques. But gradually, they evolved into something more personal. Harold Jensen asked Yamamoto about Japan, about his life before the war. Through Nakamura's patient translation, Yamamoto found himself describing Hiroshima, his family's small farm, his father's bicycle repair shop, his mother's skill at making do with almost nothing. He talked about his siblings, his interrupted education, his dreams of becoming an engineer, things he had never expected to share with an enemy. In return, Jensen talked about Nebraska, about droughts and dust storms, about the hard years before the war when farms failed and families lost everything. He talked about his own father, who had farmed this same land with horses and hand tools, and how mechanization had transformed what was possible. He talked about his son in the Pacific, about hoping the boy would come home to take over the farm someday, to continue the family's connection to this land. One afternoon in late June, as they sat in the shade of the barn during lunch, Jensen asked a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. "Do you think your family knows you're alive?" Nakamura translated, and Yamamoto felt something break inside his chest. "No," he said quietly. "In Japan, prisoners are considered dead. It would be shameful for them to hope otherwise." Jensen's face darkened. "That's wrong," he said firmly. "A man surviving isn't shameful. It's a blessing. Your mother deserves to know her son is alive." He stood up and walked toward the house, gesturing for Yamamoto to follow. Inside, Jensen pulled out paper and an envelope. Through Nakamura, he explained that the Red Cross had channels for prisoner mail, that letters could be sent to families in Japan through neutral countries. It would take months, maybe longer, but it was possible. "You should write to your mother," Jensen said. "Tell her you're alive, tell her you're being treated well, give her that peace." Yamamoto stared at the blank paper. For months, he had accepted that he was dead to his family, that any communication would only bring them renewed shame. But now, sitting in an American farmhouse, a farmer who had every reason to hate him was offering him a chance to ease his mother's pain. The contradiction was too much. Tears began to fall on the paper before he could stop them. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why do you care about my mother's pain? Why does any of this matter to you?" Jensen's answer was simple. "Because pain is pain, no matter whose mother feels it, and if I can do something to ease it, I should. That's all." Yamamoto wrote the letter that afternoon, his hands shaking. He kept it simple, just the facts. He was alive, he was unharmed, he was being treated well. He did not mention where he was or how he had been captured. He did not mention the abundance he had witnessed or the questions that now haunted him. He simply told his mother he hoped she was well, that he thought of her every day, and that he hoped to see her again someday. The letter was sent through the Red Cross channels. 7 months later, in February 1945, a response arrived. His mother's letter was short, constrained by censorship and the limitations of the communication channels. But between the formal lines, Yamamoto could read her relief, her joy, her desperate hope that he would survive to come home. She did not mention shame or dishonor. She simply said she had been praying every day for his safety, and now those prayers had been answered. By the time that letter arrived, the war had clearly turned. Even in the isolated confines of the POW camp, news filtered through. The German forces in Europe had been pushed back. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. The propaganda broadcasts from Tokyo that occasionally reached the camp spoke of glorious victories, but the prisoners knew better. They had seen what they were fighting against. They had seen the industrial might, the material abundance, the casual competence with which America waged war. Victory had never been possible. It had only been a matter of time until reality crushed the illusion. In March 1945, a new prisoner arrived at the camp, fresh from the Philippines. He was thin, almost skeletal, with eyes that had seen too much. During evening gatherings in the barracks, he told stories about the situation in Japan. American aircraft dominated the skies completely. Cities were being destroyed one by one. Food was so scarce that people were eating tree bark and grass. Children were being trained to fight with sharpened bamboo stakes, told they would die gloriously defending the home islands. The military leadership spoke of final victory, even as the nation crumbled around them. The prisoners who had spent months working on Nebraska farms listened to these stories with a growing sense of horror. They thought about the abundance they saw every day, the casual waste that would have been unthinkable in Japan. They thought about American bomber production numbers they had overheard, about the endless supply of everything, about how this war had never even scratched the surface of American capacity. "We sent men to die for a lie," Honda said quietly one evening. "Our leaders knew. They had to have known. You can't look at what we're seeing here and believe victory was ever possible. They sent us to fight a war they knew couldn't be won, and they kept sending men even as the truth became undeniable." The words hung heavy in the barracks. Around them, dozens of men grappled with the same realization. They had not failed Japan. Japan had failed them, sending them into a war that was lost before it began, sustained only by lies and the willingness to sacrifice lives for a fantasy of victory. In August, the war ended. The news came through official channels first, then was confirmed by the sudden change in atmosphere at the camp. The guards seemed relieved more than triumphant. Captain Morrison assembled the prisoners and, through Nakamura, delivered the news with straightforward simplicity. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. They would remain as prisoners for now until arrangements could be made for repatriation, but the fighting had ended. The reaction among the prisoners was complex. Relief mixed with grief, mixed with shame, mixed with something harder to name. They had survived a war that had consumed millions, but they had survived as captives, as witnesses to their own nation's defeat. What would they return to? What would they tell their families, their neighbors, about what they had seen? Yamamoto sat outside that night, looking up at the Nebraska stars. They were the same stars that shone over Hiroshima, the same stars that had watched this war unfold from beginning to end. He thought about his mother, about whether she was still alive, whether their city still stood. He thought about Harold and Martha Jensen, about their son who might finally come home. He thought about all the farms he had worked on, all the ordinary Americans he had met who had treated him with unexpected decency. The war had taught him that his leaders had lied about the enemy's strength, but Nebraska had taught him something else. His leaders had also lied about the enemy's nature. Americans were not the demons of propaganda. They were farmers and workers, parents and children, people who valued family and home and simple kindness. They were not inherently better or worse than Japanese people. They just happened to have been born in a nation with resources beyond imagining, and they had used those resources to overwhelm an enemy who had never stood a chance. Repatriation came slowly over the following months. The prisoners were processed in groups, sent first to transit camps and then home. Yamamoto's turn came in November 1945. On his last day, Harold Jensen came to the camp, bringing a small package. Inside was a collection of seeds from his farm. Corn, wheat, beans, all carefully labeled. Through Nakamura, Jensen explained that these were hardy varieties, proven in Nebraska's harsh climate. Perhaps they would grow well in Japan, too. Perhaps Yamamoto could rebuild his family's farm with them. "I hope your country recovers quickly," Jensen said. "I hope you find your family well. And I hope you'll remember that the war is over. We don't have to be enemies anymore." Yamamoto bowed deeply, Japanese formality taking over where English words failed. "I will never forget your kindness," he managed to say. "You showed me that people are people, no matter which flag flies over them." The voyage back to Japan took 3 weeks. Yamamoto spent much of that time on deck, watching the Pacific roll by, thinking about everything that had changed. He was returning to a defeated nation, a homeland devastated by war, a future uncertain and probably hard. But he carried with him knowledge that might help rebuild what had been lost. He had seen how modern farming worked. He had learned about mechanical equipment, about irrigation, about agricultural techniques far advanced beyond what Japan had known. And he had learned that former enemies could become something else, given time and goodwill. Hiroshima was gone. That was the first thing Yamamoto learned when he finally reached Japan. The city where he had grown up, where his family had lived for generations, had been destroyed by a single weapon of unimaginable power. His mother and younger brother had survived, evacuated to the countryside weeks before. His father had died in the initial blast. His sisters were alive but scattered across the country. The reunion with his mother came in a small village 40 miles from where Hiroshima had stood. She was thinner than he remembered, older, worn down by years of hardship and grief. But when she saw him, when she realized he was truly alive and truly home, something rekindled in her eyes. They held each other and wept, two survivors of a war that had consumed so much. Later, sitting in the small room she shared with 3 other displaced families, Yamamoto gave her the seeds Harold Jensen had sent. He told her about Nebraska, about farms with electricity and tractors, about abundance beyond belief. He told her about the Americans who had treated him with decency when they had every right to treat him as an enemy. He told her that he had learned things that might help them rebuild, that the war had been terrible, but the peace might offer chances for something better. His mother held the packet of seeds like it was precious treasure. "These people," she said softly, "these Americans, they sound like good farmers. Your grandfather would have liked them." In the years that followed, Yamamoto became part of the massive effort to rebuild Japan. He used his language skills, learned through months of exposure to English in the POW camp, to work with American occupation authorities. He shared his knowledge of modern farming techniques, helping to introduce mechanical equipment and improved methods to Japanese agriculture. He married, had children, built a life in a nation transformed by defeat and reconstruction. He never returned to Nebraska, but he never forgot it either. The lessons learned in those fields, the humanity shown by people who had every reason to hate, shaped his understanding of the world. When his children asked about the war, he told them about honor and duty, about service and sacrifice. But he also told them about Harold and Martha Jensen, about a farm where the lights never went out, about enemies who chose kindness over hatred. The seeds Harold Jensen had given him were planted in the rebuilt farmland near what had once been Hiroshima. They grew well in Japanese soil, proving as hardy as Jensen had promised. For decades afterward, farmers in the region planted their descendants, a quiet legacy of connection between former enemies, a reminder that even the most bitter conflicts can end, and that people on both sides are simply people, hoping to grow things and build things and see their children have better lives. The story of Japanese prisoners in Nebraska was never widely told. It was overshadowed by larger narratives of the war, the battles, the strategy, the politics. But for the men who experienced it, it remained a defining chapter in their lives. They had seen the truth about America's strength, not in terms of weapons or soldiers, but in the simple abundance of ordinary life. They had learned that propaganda lies on both sides, that enemies are made by circumstances more than nature, and that kindness is possible even in the midst of war. Yamamoto lived to age 92, dying in 2014. Among his possessions, carefully preserved, was a photograph of the Jensen farm taken during his time as a prisoner. His grandchildren, born into a Japan that was prosperous and peaceful, allied with America, could barely comprehend the world the photograph represented. He would tell them the story about seeing electric lights on every farm and thinking it must be a trick, about learning that the enemy they had been taught to hate was simply another human being trying to live a good life. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.